To think you know Henry VIII, the man with 6 wives who founded the Church of England, might already make you feel like an expert in history. But the truth is far darker, stranger, and more grotesque than any textbook could ever convey. Henry VIII wasn't just a king. He was a walking disaster, a man whose body, mind, and soul seemed to conspire together to terrify everyone around him. What you've learned in school, the charming, commanding monarch, is only the surface. Peel it back, and you find a figure so grotesque and paranoid that even the most scandalous tales of medieval Europe pale in comparison. By the end of his life, Henry was essentially a walking corpse. His body had become a stage for decay, grotesque, swollen, infected, and unbearable to anyone forced to serve him. The details of his physical decline are horrifying. His waist measured 54 inches, wider than most men were tall in his era. He weighed nearly 400 pounds when the average man might barely reach 140. But his size was only the beginning of the horror. His legs were covered with festering, oozing ulcers, massive wounds that never healed, dripping pus and dead flesh with every movement. The stench was so intense that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces, sometimes even gagging at the proximity. Servants drew straws to decide who would be forced to assist the king in dressing, because getting close to those wounds was considered a form of punishment. Yet Henry's grotesque physicality was matched, or even exceeded, by the deterioration of his mind. In 1536, a jousting accident left him unconscious for 2 hours, an event that historians believe caused massive personality changes. The accident wasn't just a physical blow. It may have been the catalyst for his later paranoia, mood swings, and violent temper. Medical experts suggest that he likely developed conditions such as Cushing's syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, uncontrolled bodily functions, and those horrific leg ulcers that refused to heal. Even his own doctors, terrified of contradicting a king who claimed divine right, hesitated to suggest he might be seriously ill. It's not only his illness and injuries that define him, it's the terror he inflicted. Henry VIII ruled by fear. He executed, imprisoned, and manipulated with a psychological cruelty that rivaled any modern horror story. And yet, his personal decline, his grotesque indulgences, and his paranoia were not just private matters, they shaped England itself. The kingdom he ruled became a reflection of his own body and mind. Swollen, infected, paranoid, and dangerous. From his bizarre eating rituals to the elaborate schemes he orchestrated against his wives, Henry VIII's life reads less like history and more like a cautionary tale about the perils of absolute power combined with unchecked obsession. This is a king whose personal decline became a public spectacle, whose body betrayed him while his mind betrayed everyone around him. In the following parts, you'll discover the shocking curiosities about Henry VIII that make even the most dramatic works of fiction look tame. His obsessive eating, his paranoid surveillance, the torment of his wives, and the grotesque reality of his final years. By the time this story ends, the image of Henry VIII as the charismatic, commanding monarch you learned about will be completely shattered. You will meet the king not as a figure of authority, but as a cautionary legend of how power, paranoia, and human frailty can intertwine into something monstrous. This is the real Henry VIII, and his story begins not with triumph, but with the unraveling of a body and mind that no crown could save. By the middle of his reign, Henry VIII had transformed from a vigorous, athletic young king into a monstrous shadow of his former self. His once toned frame had ballooned into a staggering 400-pound figure, a mass so enormous that moving through the halls of his palaces became an ordeal in itself. Courtiers whispered in fear and disgust as they watched him struggle across rooms, carried in specially designed chairs or propped up on mechanical contraptions, a grotesque spectacle of power twisted into decay. His health was failing, and with it, the dignity of his kingship. The most horrifying feature of Henry's late years was his legs. These were no mere sores, they were festering ulcers that had been aggravated by years of obesity, poor circulation, and infection. Historians estimate the wounds were so severe that they produced continuous pus, foul-smelling and impossible to conceal. Servants who had to clean or dress him reportedly gagged, fainted, or even begged to be excused from the duty. The stench could reportedly be detected from several rooms away, forcing courtiers to carry perfumed handkerchiefs or wear scented gloves just to approach the king. Some accounts suggest that the smell of Henry's legs alone could render a gathering of nobles silent with discomfort, the air thick with nausea and fear. Yet it wasn't only the stench or the sores that struck terror. It was what they represented. A body failing completely while the king remained in command. No history textbook captures the psychological toll this took on those who served him daily. To stand in the presence of a ruler whose body was literally rotting before their eyes was to confront mortality itself, magnified by power. It wasn't just grotesque, it was deeply destabilizing. Even men of hardened constitution were reportedly shaken by the sight and smell, a reminder that absolute power offered no immunity from the ravages of the flesh. Modern medical historians speculate that Henry's condition may have been exacerbated by Cushing syndrome, a disease that could explain both his massive weight gain and the ulcers that defied treatment. Combined with his history of severe head trauma, a jousting accident that left him unconscious for hours, his physical decline intertwined with mental deterioration. The king who once exuded charisma now manifested paranoia, mood swings and violent temper. Those around him had to navigate not only the hazards of his body but the volatility of his mind. Despite this, Henry clung to his kingly prerogative. He continued to rule, to legislate, and to indulge even as his body betrayed him at every turn. He could barely walk from room to room without assistance, yet he demanded obedience, loyalty, and admiration. His meals, once joyous feasts shared with courtiers, became theatrical rituals of gluttony and fear. Servants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went because the simple act of sitting unaided was impossible. Even his most loyal attendants lived under the shadow of his unpredictability. One misstep, one glance, or one word could result in immediate punishment or death. The grotesque combination of illness, obesity, and unchecked authority created a climate of terror in the court. His body was not merely a private matter. It was a public instrument of intimidation. To witness the king move was to witness the consequences of absolute power pressed to its most disturbing extremes. It's one thing to rule with an iron fist. It is another to govern as a man whose own body is a spectacle of horror. This duality, power intertwined with decay, would come to define the final years of Henry VIII. And yet, even as his physical condition worsened, the king's mind remained dangerously active. He was consumed by suspicion, believing that betrayal lurked behind every door, that plots and conspiracies were constantly brewing in his court. The interplay between his failing body and his ruthless mind created an unstoppable machine of fear, turning his kingdom into an extension of his own decaying frame. A place where everyone felt the weight of his grotesque presence, both physically and psychologically. In the following sections, we will explore how this monstrous body affected not only the king himself but the lives of those around him, his wives, his children, and the entire English court. You will see how disease, injury, and paranoia combined to create a reign as terrifying in its personal horror as it was in its political consequences. Henry VIII was not merely a man. He was a living, walking nightmare, and the court of England became a stage for his slow, horrific undoing. One of the pivotal moments that historians point to when trying to explain Henry VIII's transformation from a dashing young monarch into a paranoid, monstrous figure is the jousting accident of 1536. By all accounts, it was a seemingly routine tournament event, a chance for the king to display his athleticism and martial skill. But in a single catastrophic instant, everything changed. Henry was unseated from his horse, thrown with terrifying force, and suffered a severe blow to the head. He was unconscious for 2 hours, a duration so prolonged in medieval terms that it was considered almost a brush with death. This injury wasn't a minor bump. It likely caused a significant traumatic brain injury. Modern medical experts suggest that such an injury could have affected his frontal lobe, the region of the brain responsible for personality, impulse control, and judgment. The king, who had once been known for his charm, wit, and commanding presence, began exhibiting traits that were increasingly erratic and violent. Mood swings became extreme, bouts of rage were common, and paranoia escalated to levels that would terrify even the most stoic courtier. The jousting accident didn't just explain his volatile behavior. It also provides a lens through which to understand his increasingly cruel treatment of those around him. Before the injury, Henry was ambitious and assertive, but not entirely consumed by suspicion. Afterward, he became a ruler who demanded absolute loyalty, executing or imprisoning anyone he suspected, or imagined, might betray him. This paranoia extended to his wives, children, and closest advisors. Even minor slights or imagined offenses could provoke a response of lethal intensity. It's also important to consider how this injury may have compounded his physical decline. Henry's inability to heal effectively from his leg ulcers, combined with rapid weight gain and other health issues, would have been exacerbated by stress, poor circulation, and systemic inflammation, all conditions worsened by the hormonal and neurological changes associated with traumatic brain injury. The combination of physical pain and mental instability created a feedback loop. The more his body deteriorated, the more paranoid and irritable he became. The more paranoid he became, the more his court and household lived in fear, which only reinforced his obsessive control. This period of his life also coincides with the beginning of his increasingly elaborate and cruel punishments, particularly for his wives. And Boleyn's eventual execution, orchestrated through a carefully planned frame-up, can be traced in part to a king whose judgment had been severely compromised. The same paranoia that made him fear plots against his throne made him suspicious of even the most intimate relationships. It is no coincidence that after the jousting accident, Henry's reign became a landscape of fear, intrigue, and psychological manipulation. Historians have debated the extent to which this brain injury explains his behavior, but the evidence is compelling. Contemporary accounts describe sudden fits of rage, irrational decisions, and obsessive suspicion. Medical examinations of his later symptoms, including severe obesity, leg ulcers, and erratic temper, suggest a complex interplay of neurological, endocrine, and psychological factors. In short, the jousting accident was not just an unfortunate sporting mishap. It may well have been the turning point that transformed Henry VIII from a vigorous, ambitious king into a tyrant ruled as much by his body and brain as by his crown. In the coming parts, we will see how the consequences of this injury manifested in daily life at court, in the king's obsessive eating habits, his cruel treatment of wives, and the paranoia that made England itself a kingdom governed by fear. The jousting accident is more than history. It is the moment where the story of a king becomes the story of a man unmoored from reason, trapped in a body and mind that would terrify everyone around him. By the time Henry VIII entered the final decades of his life, his kingship had become inseparable from the horror of his personal decline. The once athletic, charming monarch had been replaced by a grotesque figure, whose body and mind both demanded fear and obedience. No longer could he move through his palaces unaided. Even walking from room to room required a specially designed chair, or the assistance of several attendants. Yet, despite his failing health and incapacitating obesity, he continued to rule with absolute authority, and his court learned quickly that proximity to the king was as much a test of endurance as it was of loyalty. His physical limitations were terrifyingly public. The ulcers on his legs, festering and continuously oozing, forced servants to maintain a constant, humiliating vigil. Pieces of dead flesh sometimes fell to the floors as he moved, requiring attendants to follow behind him with cloths and buckets, cleaning up in what could only be described as a grotesque procession. The smell was overpowering, making it impossible for anyone to remain near him without gagging or fainting. Yet, this was not merely a private matter. It became a form of psychological control. Courtiers and officials were forced to confront daily the reality of their king's decay, a constant reminder that the sovereign, despite divine claims, was human and dangerously unstable. Even as his body betrayed him, Henry's mind remained fearfully alert and ruthlessly strategic. He wielded his illness and immobility as tools of intimidation, reinforcing his authority through sheer terror. To witness the king's struggle to sit, to eat, or to be dressed was to confront mortality and power simultaneously. The courtiers were trapped in a paradox. Obey a man whose body inspired both disgust and awe, or risk becoming the target of his suspicion. The grotesque physicality of his kingship merged seamlessly with political terror, making his court a theater of horror in which every act of service came with implicit danger. His reign of terror extended beyond the body into the very structure of governance. Henry demanded total loyalty, and dissent was swiftly punished, whether real or imagined. Nobles learned to guard their words, gestures, and even expressions, for a poorly chosen glance or statement could result in imprisonment, execution, or worse, public humiliation. Every aspect of royal life was meticulously controlled, with fear serving as both weapon and currency. The The king's incapacity did not weaken his rule. In many ways, it amplified the psychological power he exercised over those around him. Henry's suffering was relentless, and yet he found ways to enforce suffering on others, most notably through his treatment of his wives. The psychological torment inflicted upon them, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Catherine of Aragon and others, was magnified by his own deranged combination of paranoia and cruelty. The king's personal decline became a public instrument of terror, ensuring that his authority remained unchallenged, even as his physical dominance waned. In essence, Henry VIII's kingship evolved into a living paradox. A ruler simultaneously weakened and empowered, incapacitated yet omnipotent in his ability to terrify. His body, grotesque and unmanageable, became both symbol and instrument of his absolute authority. The decay of flesh and mind was inseparable from the mechanisms of control he deployed over England, creating a court where obedience was enforced through horror, suffering, and relentless surveillance. As we move forward, the story of Henry's reign of terror becomes even more chilling when viewed through the lens of his treatment of the people closest to him: his wives, his children, and his courtiers. The grotesque fusion of illness, paranoia, and absolute power is the stage upon which some of the most shocking events of his life would unfold, leaving a legacy of fear, suffering, and psychological manipulation that continues to fascinate historians centuries later. Henry VIII's reign of terror extended far beyond the court's public corridors. It reached into the intimate lives of his 6 wives. History often simplifies these women's fates. 2 were executed, 1 died in childbirth, and the others lived out their lives in varying degrees of obscurity. But the reality was far darker. Henry's treatment of his wives was a calculated blend of psychological torment, public humiliation, and deadly manipulation that would make even modern depictions of serial cruelty seem tame. Anne Boleyn, perhaps the most famous, endured a nightmare engineered by her own husband. Before her execution, Henry orchestrated an elaborate frame-up, and was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes designed to justify her death while simultaneously consolidating his control. One of the most harrowing details is that Anne had to witness the executions of 5 men, including her own brother, accused of sleeping with her. Imagine standing there, knowing you are next, forced to endure the deaths of loved ones for a crime you did not commit. The psychological trauma was intentional. Henry's manipulation ensured that fear and despair became as lethal as any sword. Catherine Howard, another young bride, suffered similarly extreme treatment. Barely a teenager when she married Henry, she became a pawn in a king's escalating paranoia. Upon discovering her past relationships, Henry did not merely execute her. He changed the law, declaring it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their sexual history. The legal reform itself underscores the depth of his obsession and vindictiveness. Yet the cruelest elements were the psychological games. Affection one day, threats the next, leaving these young women in a constant state of terror, unsure which action might provoke their death. Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, endured years of isolation and humiliation. Denied access to her daughter Mary, she was effectively placed under house arrest while Henry spread rumors questioning her sanity. She died alone, possibly poisoned, sending letters to Henry that he never read. The tragedy of her later years illustrates how Henry's cruelty was not only immediate and violent, but also calculated, extending over years to break spirit and influence. Even the supposedly fortunate wives were not spared psychological torment. Anne of Cleves was forced into a marriage annulment, coerced to express gratitude for being spared execution. Jane Seymour, who died of natural causes, was no exception. Henry had already begun plotting his next marriage within 9 days of her funeral. Every relationship was transactional, every human connection a matter of power and control. Divorce, escape, or resistance were impossible. To oppose him was to endanger not just oneself but potentially one's entire family. Henry's wives were trapped in a system designed to strip them of agency and inflict fear, a grim reflection of the king's own internal chaos. Their suffering highlights the intersection of personal pathology and political power. A man whose body was falling apart, whose mind was consumed with paranoia, and whose obsession with control turned intimate relationships into instruments of terror. In the next section, we will explore how Henry's obsession with consumption and excess extended to another domain: his insatiable, often grotesque appetite which mirrored the excess and brutality of his personal and political life. From this lens, the king's gluttony becomes more than eccentricity. It is an extension of his monstrous presence, a physical manifestation of the same paranoia and obsession that made his reign so terrifying. Henry VIII's cruelty was not limited to physical punishment or psychological torment. It extended into the very institution of marriage itself. Every union was a tool for power, a stage for control, and in many cases a trap for his wives. Marriage under Henry was rarely about affection or companionship. It was about survival, obedience, and the king's unrelenting obsession with dominance. And of Cleves, for example, experienced this in a profoundly humiliating way. Their marriage, arranged for political alliance, was effectively a sham from the start. Henry found Anne personally unattractive and quickly sought to dissolve the union. But rather than simply separating, he coerced Anne into a formal annulment, making her publicly acknowledge the marriage as invalid while also demanding her gratitude for being spared execution. The queen had no choice but to comply, performing the ritual of submission to a man whose whims dictated life and death. What might have been a legal formality became a humiliating theater of survival, an exercise in psychological dominance that reinforced the king's power and Anne's vulnerability. Jane Seymour, considered the fortunate one for dying of natural causes, still experienced the calculated manipulations that characterized Henry's marriages. She gave birth to the long-desired male heir, Edward, yet even her death could not halt the king's obsession with conquest and succession. Within 9 days of her funeral, Henry was already planning his next marriage, treating her death not as a moment of mourning but as a blank page for his next strategic move. This transactional approach to marriage was not unique. It reflected a pattern in which human relationships were entirely subordinate to Henry's desires, paranoia, and sense of entitlement. Even the fortunate outcomes carried their own form of coercion and terror. Each wife had to navigate a landscape where defiance could mean execution and obedience could be a temporary reprieve at best. Divorce, elopement, or resistance was not an option. Their very survival depended on subjugating their will to Henry's, enduring a psychological suffocation that few historians fully convey. Henry's manipulations extended beyond the bedroom or the throne room. They infiltrated legal systems, family networks, and the very perception of morality. These fake marriages highlight a recurring theme in Henry's reign: his need to control not only his own body and desires but also the lives of those closest to him. The king's paranoia transformed intimate bonds into instruments of power, where love, loyalty, or affection had no meaning unless sanctioned by the crown. Even death could not grant reprieve from the reach of his obsession. This relentless manipulation foreshadowed other manifestations of Henry's excess and obsession, particularly his gluttony. The same drive that turned marriages into tools of control, an insatiable appetite for power, dominance, and ritualized display, would later appear in the extraordinary scale of his meals, his elaborate eating habits, and his compulsive food rituals. In the next section we will delve into Henry VIII's monstrous appetite, a grotesque mirror of his inner excesses and the terrifying spectacle of a king who turned consumption into performance. Henry VIII's appetite was legendary, and not merely in the sense of enjoying good food. By the end of his life, his eating habits had become a grotesque reflection of his excess, paranoia, and obsession with display. He consumed roughly 5,000 calories a day, more than double what an active adult male required, while his body could barely support the exertion of walking. But the quantity was only the beginning. The spectacle of his meals was a theater of gluttony, terror, and ritual. A typical royal feast under Henry VIII was overwhelming in both scale and variety. Entire roasted pigs were brought to the table alongside multiple whole chickens, layers of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to fill a small river. Kitchens employed over 200 staff members working around the clock to prepare more than 800 distinct dishes each day for his household. Henry personally tasted dozens of these dishes before choosing which he would eat. Even a simple meal could take hours to complete, often performed in front of dozens of courtiers who watched in awe and sometimes horror, as the king gorged himself. But quantity alone does not capture the strangeness of Henry's eating. He believed that specific foods had magical properties. Swan, he thought, would enhance his grace. Deer would improve his hunting skills. Oysters would, in his mind, enhance his sexual performance. He consumed these foods in massive quantities, fixating on their supposed effects. Every bite became an elaborate ritual, a symbolic act tied to his identity as king, hunter, and lover. Food was not just nourishment. It was a statement of power, a performance of dominance over nature, his body, and everyone who watched him. Paranoia infused every meal. Henry's chefs and attendants were compelled to follow strict procedures to prevent poisoning. Food tasters were required to sample dishes and wait for signs of delayed toxicity before the king would eat. Kitchens were sealed and guarded, spices and water meticulously checked. What should have been a basic act of sustenance became a military operation, a prolonged and theatrical display of caution and control. Henry's gluttony also reflected a peculiar social hierarchy. Common foods, such as turnips or barley, were forbidden at the royal table. These staples, eaten by ordinary people, were deemed beneath the king's status, even though they were far healthier than the mountains of meat, sugar, and wine he consumed daily. The king's meals became a symbol of his absolute authority, separating him from the common world not only politically but biologically, as though his body alone reinforced the boundaries of power. The grotesque combination of quantity, ritual, and paranoia transformed Henry's eating into a spectacle that terrified and fascinated the court alike. It was an extension of his control, a performance that mirrored the psychological manipulation he employed in his marriages, governance, and daily interactions. To witness Henry eat was to witness excess magnified into something almost theatrical. A king, a monster, and a cautionary figure all at once. In the next part, we will examine the more extreme rituals surrounding his consumption, the magical beliefs, food superstitions, and obsessive precautions that made dining with Henry VIII as much a psychological trial as a physical event. Stop. Henry VIII's relationship with food was more than gluttony. It was an obsession intertwined with superstition and paranoia. He believed that certain foods could imbue him with strength, virility, or grace, and he consumed them with a ritualistic intensity that would seem absurd, or horrifying, to any modern observer. Swan, for example, was thought to enhance his elegance and poise, while deer supposedly made him a better hunter. Oysters, notoriously, were considered by the king to boost his sexual performance. Each meal became an intricate performance, a calculated act where ingestion and ritual merged into power. But the king's obsessive eating was not only about supposed magical properties. It was inseparable from his paranoia. Every dish was tasted by multiple servants to detect poison, and even after sampling, they had to wait 30 minutes to ensure no delayed toxicity. The kitchens themselves were heavily guarded and sealed, spices, water, and every ingredient meticulously tested. A simple meal became a military operation, a procession of caution and fear. Those who served him lived in constant anxiety, aware that a single mistake could be fatal, and that even routine cooking carried immense personal risk. The theatricality of his meals reinforced social hierarchies and projected authority. Common foods like turnips, barley, and other staples were forbidden in his presence, deemed unworthy of a king, despite their nutritional superiority to the mountains of meat, sugar, and wine he consumed. Dining with Henry was not merely sustenance. It was a ritualized assertion of supremacy. Courtiers observed, endured, and often suffered from the sheer spectacle of excess, their discomfort amplifying the king's power. His compulsive rituals extended to the presentation and sampling of food. Dishes were displayed as grand tableaus, with hundreds of choices arranged meticulously for visual effect before tasting. Meals could last for hours, a prolonged demonstration of his wealth, taste, and dominance. The act of eating became an elaborate theater in which Henry was both performer and audience, commanding attention, inspiring awe, and instilling fear. Henry's food paranoia mirrored the broader obsessions that shaped his reign: control, spectacle, and the manipulation of those around him. In his private rituals, the king revealed the same obsessive compulsions that dictated his treatment of wives, nobles, and even children. Every bite was a calculated measure of power, a performance of fear, and a reinforcement of hierarchy. As we move to the next part, we will see how Henry's paranoia extended far beyond food into every corner of his court and kingdom. His obsessive surveillance, secret passages, and elaborate spy networks made England itself a stage for terror, a reflection of the king's own decaying and paranoid mind. Stop. Henry VIII's paranoia did not stop at food or marriage. It consumed every aspect of life in his court. By the later years of his reign, he had transformed England itself into a kingdom under surveillance, a labyrinth of fear where every conversation, gesture, and expression could be interpreted as treason. His obsession with betrayal was so intense that even his closest advisors, friends, and family were subject to constant scrutiny. No one could be trusted, and the web of suspicion extended outward, creating a climate of terror that infiltrated every corner of his court. His personal security was obsessive and extreme. Henry slept with loaded crossbows beside his bed and daggers under his pillow, armed guards stationed inside his chambers. Secret passages were constructed in his palaces not for convenience or romance, but as escape routes in the event of assassination attempts. Peepholes and hidden listening devices were installed throughout the buildings, so he could spy on courtiers, advisors, and guests. This was not mere precaution. It was a manifestation of the king's relentless fear, turning every interaction into a potential threat assessment. Henry's spy networks were intricate and multilayered. He employed informants to watch other informants, creating a convoluted system in which no one could be certain of whom they could trust. Courtiers and servants alike became both watchers and the watched, their loyalty constantly tested by the king's delusions. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance was immense. Fear became a daily reality, shaping behavior, speech, and even thought. A misstep, an idle comment, or a perceived look of disapproval could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. Even his children were not immune. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth were monitored as if they were potential conspirators, a testament to the depth of Henry's paranoia. His suspicion extended into the legal system, where crimes that had not yet occurred were sometimes punished preemptively. Individuals were executed based on dreams, rumors, or hypothetical plots, reflecting a ruler who trusted no one and feared everything. Henry's paranoia also intersected with his obsession with food and ritual. Kitchens were sealed, every step of preparation observed, and even the salt and spices were tested for poison. Eating became not only an act of sustenance but a demonstration of control and survival, a theater of power in which his fear dictated the behavior of hundreds of attendants. Every corner of the palace mirrored the king's mental state, tightly controlled, meticulously observed, and saturated with tension. This climate of fear ensured that obedience was maintained, but at a profound cost. The court operated under a constant sense of dread. Nobles turned on one another, and the social fabric of loyalty was fractured by the pervasive paranoia of the king. England under Henry VIII was not merely a kingdom. It was an extension of his decaying body and mind, a psychological fortress where absolute power and absolute fear were inseparable. In the next section, we will explore how this obsession with control and fear continued to the very end of Henry's life, and even after death, his grotesque body maintained its capacity for chaos and horror. Even death could not release Henry VIII from the tyranny he imposed on his court. By his final weeks, the king's body had become a grotesque spectacle of decay and disease. So massive and incapacitated was he that servants had to transport him in specially designed chairs with pulleys and wheels. Every movement was a logistical operation, requiring the coordination of multiple attendants just to move him from room to room. Yet it was not only the sheer size that made him horrifying, it was the condition of his body. His leg ulcers had deteriorated to the point of producing chunks of rotting flesh that would fall onto the floors as he was moved. Servants followed closely behind with cloths and buckets, cleaning up the remnants of their king's decaying body. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of infection, sweat, and the byproducts of decomposition, so intense that even seasoned physicians struggled to remain in the room. Witnesses describe a scene that resembled something from a horror tale, rather than the court of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs. Henry's physical collapse was mirrored by his paranoia to the very end. Even when incapacitated, he demanded strict adherence to his procedures. Meals were still tested for poison, attendants maintained their positions, and guards ensured that no one approached without authorization. Death did not diminish his capacity for control, it simply amplified the grotesque spectacle of it. The preparations for his burial were no less dramatic. His massive corpse had to be wrapped in lead sheets and enclosed in multiple wooden coffins to contain the gases of decomposition. Yet even this was insufficient. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, the coffin exploded under the pressure of trapped gases, spewing decomposing matter into the hearse and onto the streets. Accounts describe dogs lapping up the remains that had leaked onto the road, an appalling final humiliation for a man who had claimed divine right to rule. Even burial presented difficulties. The lead-lined coffin was so heavy that the ground could barely support it, requiring multiple attempts to inter him properly. Reports persisted for years afterward of strange odors and noises emanating from his tomb, a testament to the ongoing decomposition and the horrifying aftermath of his final days. Some historians speculate that several attendants who handled his body fell ill or died shortly afterward, possibly from infections contracted during these gruesome tasks. Henry VIII's death, rather than ending his reign of terror, transformed it into a spectacle that would haunt contemporaries for years. His final days exemplified the grotesque intersection of absolute power, physical decay, and psychological terror. The man who had terrorized England with his paranoia, cruelty, and obsession left behind not a peaceful legacy but a scene of chaos, fear, and grotesque fascination. A fitting end for a king whose life had been marked by excess, cruelty, and horror. In the next part, we will examine how the combination of paranoia, gluttony, and psychological manipulation throughout Henry's reign left a lasting impact on England and its people, demonstrating that his legacy extended far beyond his death. Henry VIII's reign did not end with his death. The psychological terror, systemic paranoia, and social manipulation he instilled had repercussions that shaped England long afterward. The fear he cultivated throughout his court left deep scars in the political and social fabric of the nation. Courtiers, servants, and nobility had been trained to mistrust one another, turning loyalty into a constant negotiation and obedience into a survival tactic. Even after Henry's demise, these patterns of fear lingered, affecting decisions, alliances, and the culture of governance for years. The king's obsession with control, surveillance, and punishment created precedents that would influence English politics for generations. His establishment of networks of spies and informants became a model for later monarchs, embedding the concept that information, and its manipulation, was as powerful as military or economic strength. Courtiers had learned that even proximity to the sovereign carried inherent danger. Suspicion alone could lead to execution or imprisonment. The echoes of this culture of fear permeated the halls of power, shaping how future rulers and advisors interacted. Moreover, the psychological trauma imposed on his wives, children, and closest allies demonstrated the extreme reach of absolute power. The treatment of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and others was a brutal lesson in obedience and subjugation, serving as a warning to anyone who might challenge the king. Even those who survived his wrath were marked by the experience, their lives irrevocably altered by the terror imposed upon them. This legacy of manipulation, legal exploitation, and emotional torment left a lasting imprint on English society, reinforcing the dangers of unchecked authority. Henry's grotesque physical decay and excessive consumption were not merely personal tragedies. They were instruments of terror, visible reminders of mortality, vulnerability, and the king's omnipotence. Courtiers were forced to witness his suffering, making the grotesque spectacle of his body a daily lesson in obedience. The interplay between his physical deterioration, paranoia, and absolute control demonstrated how power could be reinforced through both fear and spectacle, a lesson that resonated far beyond his lifetime. In sum, Henry VIII's legacy was not limited to the Church of England, the 6 marriages, or the consolidation of royal authority. It was also a cautionary tale of how unchecked power, amplified by paranoia and obsession, can warp human behavior, instill fear, and manipulate societies. His reign became a living case study of terror, a monarch who controlled with an iron fist, governed with a fearful mind, and displayed a body that terrified as much as it commanded. The next section will explore the interplay between his physical excesses, paranoia, and how these factors converged to create one of the most infamous reigns in European history, a reign in which spectacle, fear, and grotesque human frailty became inseparable. Henry VIII's life presents a unique convergence of physical excess, psychological paranoia, and absolute political power. Each aspect of his existence, his grotesque body, his obsessive surveillance, his violent enforcement of loyalty, and his theatrical displays of gluttony, served to reinforce the others, creating a feedback loop that magnified his influence and terror. His obesity and festering wounds were not merely personal ailments. They were public instruments, a constant visual reminder of the king's mortality and dominance simultaneously. The grotesque spectacle of his decaying body became a tool of intimidation, ensuring that courtiers, servants, and even family members maintained obedience out of fear, revulsion, and awe. Paranoia in turn shaped governance itself. The king's fear of betrayal extended to every corner of his court and kingdom. Spies observed other spies, hidden chambers and passages monitored private conversations, and even the royal children were treated as potential conspirators. This pervasive suspicion destabilized social bonds, turning loyalty into a calculated act rather than a natural sentiment. Relationships, marriages, and even casual interactions became a theater of strategic behavior. Everyone around the king lived under the constant threat of punishment, a situation that reinforced his authority while simultaneously creating a culture of fear and uncertainty that endured long past his death. The combination of excess and paranoia also manifested in ritualistic behaviors, particularly in the king's consumption of food. Meals were not merely nourishment but elaborate performances, ritualized acts of power, superstition, and control. The obsessive testing for poison, the rigid adherence to preparation protocols, and the belief in magical properties of specific foods all reflected the same compulsions that governed his treatment of wives, courtiers, and subjects. Eating became both a survival tactic and a spectacle, a microcosm of his reign in which fear, power, and ritual intersected. Moreover, Henry's obsession with succession, control, and dynastic security extended this fusion of excess and paranoia into legal and marital systems. Laws were manipulated, marriages orchestrated or annulled at will, and punishments meted out with a chilling combination of calculation and cruelty. His wives became both tools and victims of this system, their lives entangled in a web of legal, social, and emotional manipulation that reinforced the king's absolute authority. The grotesque, paranoid, and excessive aspects of Henry VIII's life coalesced into a singular historical phenomenon, a reign in which human frailty, obsession, and absolute power were inseparable. The king's body, mind, and court became stages for a living drama of fear and domination, a spectacle that both fascinated and horrified contemporaries. His reign serves as a stark reminder that absolute power, when combined with obsession and paranoia, can produce a ruler as monstrous in life as in legend. In the next section, we will examine the long-term consequences of Henry's reign on English society, exploring how his terror, manipulation, and spectacle reshaped political, social, and cultural landscapes for generations. Henry VIII's reign left an indelible mark on England, far beyond his personal excesses and the terror he inflicted on his court. The political, social, and cultural consequences of his actions rippled through generations, influencing how power, loyalty, and fear were perceived long after his death. The culture of surveillance, manipulation, and psychological control that he perfected did not vanish. It became embedded in the mechanisms of governance, shaping future monarchs and the very structure of the English court. The legal and religious transformations initiated under Henry also had lasting effects. The establishment of the Church of England and the monarch's assertion of absolute authority over both religious and secular matters fundamentally altered the balance of power in England. Yet intertwined with these historical milestones was a darker legacy: the reinforcement of fear as a political tool. Nobles and commoners alike had learned that defiance, perceived disloyalty, or even careless words could have catastrophic consequences. This culture of fear lingered, creating a society acutely aware of hierarchy, obedience, and the fragility of personal security in the shadow of absolute authority. The grotesque spectacle of Henry's body and the extreme conditions surrounding his death also contributed to a broader social memory of his reign. Tales of his ulcers, bloating, and the explosive decomposition of his coffin became cautionary stories, warning against the perils of excess and tyranny. These stories, circulating among both elite and common populations, reinforced a perception of monarchy that combined awe with terror, a ruler capable of both divine command and grotesque human fallibility. Henry's treatment of his wives and children left lasting social and familial scars. The manipulation, coercion, and psychological torment inflicted on those closest to him set precedents for the control of royal households and the intersection of personal life with political strategy. Women, in particular, were keenly aware of the precarious balance between survival and obedience, a dynamic that influenced marriage, inheritance, and family structures for decades. Even culturally, The spectacle of his excess, paranoia, and cruelty inspired both fear and fascination. Artists, writers, and historians would later depict Henry not just as a monarch but as a cautionary figure, a symbol of what absolute power can do to the human body, mind, and spirit. The blending of historical fact with legend ensured that Henry VIII became more than a king. He became an enduring archetype of grotesque authority, obsession, and the human capacity for cruelty. In the next part, we will explore specific anecdotes and lesser-known events from Henry's reign that illuminate the intersection of his paranoia, gluttony, and obsession with control, offering a closer look at the daily realities of living under one of history's most infamous rulers. Living in Henry VIII's court was a daily exercise in fear, obedience, and psychological tension. Every aspect of life, from personal conduct to professional duty, was filtered through the lens of the king's paranoia. Courtiers learned quickly that the smallest misstep could have devastating consequences, whether it was an offhand remark, a glance deemed disrespectful, or even a failure to participate in his elaborate rituals. The king's obsessions shaped not only the structure of court life, but also the behaviors of everyone within it. Meals, already grotesque and ritualized, became public spectacles where courtiers watched in terror as Henry consumed mountains of food. Mistakes in the kitchen, delays in service, or lapses in ceremonial procedure could provoke violent outbursts. The presence of spies ensured that every action and every word was observed, recorded, and potentially used as evidence of disloyalty. Life under Henry was a continuous performance, where survival depended on mastering both decorum and deception. Even leisure and entertainment were tightly controlled. Tournaments, hunts, and performances were often staged to reinforce the king's power, ensuring that spectators and participants alike understood their place within the hierarchy. The rewards for favor were great, but so too were the risks for perceived offense. Favor could evaporate overnight, replaced by suspicion, isolation, or worse. Fear became both a tool of governance and a social currency, shaping relationships and alliances throughout the court. The daily reality of serving Henry also exposed attendants to physical hazards. Those who assisted him during illness, moved him from room to room, or attended his table risked contact with his festering wounds, exposure to his overwhelming stench, and the possibility of disease. Even survival depended on careful observation of protocols, unwavering attention, and sometimes sheer luck. In this environment, obedience was not optional, it was a matter of life and death. Henry VIII's obsessive control extended to his family as well. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth were constantly monitored, a reflection of his fear that even his children could conspire against him. The king's mistrust infiltrated private and intimate spaces, making personal relationships a battleground for loyalty and survival. Emotional life, affection, and family bonds were subordinated to political calculation, paranoia, and the king's compulsive need for dominance. Daily life under Henry VIII was thus a complex interplay of fear, ritual, and spectacle. Every moment was governed by the unpredictable whims of a monarch whose obsession with control, display, and survival pervaded all aspects of existence. Observing these routines reveals not only the grotesque dimensions of his physical and psychological excess, but also the profound human cost of absolute power wielded without restraint. In the next section, we will explore the dramatic and often tragic consequences of Henry's paranoia on specific individuals, illustrating how fear and suspicion translated into real human suffering within his court. The human cost of Henry VIII's paranoia was starkly visible in the fates of those who lived closest to him. Courtiers, advisors, and family members alike were ensnared in a web of fear and manipulation, where even minor missteps could prove fatal. Innocent behavior was frequently interpreted as betrayal, and loyalty offered no guarantee of safety. In this environment, survival required constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and often, a willingness to sacrifice others to maintain one's own position. Anne Boleyn's ordeal exemplifies the extreme psychological torment Henry inflicted. Not only was she accused of adultery and treason, but she was forced to witness the execution of 5 men, including her own brother, who were framed as her accomplices. The terror of standing before a king whose whims dictated life or death was compounded by her inability to defend herself or trust any ally. Her ultimate execution was the tragic culmination of a systematic campaign of manipulation, coercion, and psychological warfare. Catherine Howard, even younger and more vulnerable, experienced similar horrors. The teenage queen was executed after Henry discovered past relationships, but before that, she lived in constant fear of his scrutiny, manipulation, and the ruthless enforcement of his version of honor. Laws were adapted to criminalize behaviors that had never been illegal, illustrating how Henry reshaped reality itself to justify his paranoia and vindictiveness. Even those who survived Henry's wrath were left marked by it. Jane Seymour's death from childbirth complications offered her temporary reprieve from the king's cruelty, but her life and role had already been dictated by his obsessive desire for a male heir. And of Cleves, spared execution through a forced annulment, lived in a constant state of caution and compliance, navigating a precarious existence defined by gratitude for survival, rather than genuine autonomy. The broader court was similarly affected. Nobles learned to spy on one another, servants were compelled to betray their masters, and alliances were constantly renegotiated under the threat of suspicion. The culture of fear Henry fostered reshaped social interactions, embedding mistrust, calculation, and self-preservation into the very fabric of daily life. Trust became a scarce commodity, and human relationships were transactional, conditioned by survival rather than loyalty or affection. These tragedies reveal that Henry's reign was not only grotesque in its physical excesses and paranoia, but profoundly human in its consequences. The suffering of individuals, the manipulation of families, and the terror instilled in courtiers illustrate a monarchy where absolute power was inseparable from human cost. Observing these outcomes underscores the extreme social and psychological environment created by one man's obsessions, offering a chilling perspective on the lived reality of England under Henry VIII. In the next part, we will examine how even in death, Henry's reign of horror extended beyond his own body, influencing perceptions, rituals, and the memory of kingship in England for generations. Henry VIII's influence did not end with his physical demise. In fact, his death amplified the grotesque and terrifying elements of his legacy. The catastrophic state of his body at the time of death became a public spectacle, cementing his reign as one defined not only by power but by horror. The decomposition of his corpse, the explosive failure of his lead-lined coffin during the funeral procession, and the lingering stench and rumors surrounding his tomb ensured that his death became as infamous as his life. These events transformed his final moments into a macabre lesson in mortality, power, and the consequences of absolute excess. Even in death, Henry's paranoia seemed to resonate. The special preparations for his burial, lead wrapping, multiple wooden coffins, reinforced structures, reflected his lifetime obsession with control and security. Yet these precautions were insufficient, and the resulting explosion of his coffin was both literal and symbolic. The king, who had tried to control every aspect of life, food, and court intrigue, could not contain the inevitable forces of decay and nature. Dogs licking up his remains on the funeral route symbolized the ultimate loss of dignity for a monarch who had wielded divine authority on earth. The social and psychological impact of his grotesque death was profound. Those who had served him were traumatized, with some reportedly falling ill or dying shortly afterward, possibly from infections. Witnesses and attendants carried the memory of his final weeks, the stench, the rot, the fear, into their retellings, ensuring that Henry VIII became a figure of legend, horror, and caution. The extraordinary circumstances of his burial and funeral continued to influence perceptions of kingship, power, and mortality for generations. Culturally, Henry's death cemented his image as a monarch whose life and body were inseparable instruments of control, fear, and spectacle. Chroniclers, artists, and historians preserved accounts that emphasized the grotesque, the terrifying, and the excessive, blending fact and legend to create an enduring archetype of absolute power's potential for corruption and horror. His physical decay, obsessive rituals, and tyrannical behavior combined to leave a legacy that was as much about fear and fascination as it was about politics and governance. Ultimately, Henry VIII's posthumous influence highlights the convergence of his life's themes: excess, paranoia, spectacle, and human frailty. Even in death, he demonstrated the consequences of a ruler unrestrained by humility, compassion, or reason, offering a chilling reminder of the human and societal costs of absolute power. In the next section, we will examine how historians interpret Henry VIII today, balancing the myths, legends, and grotesque tales with historical facts to understand the full impact of his reign. Henry VIII's life and reign have been the subject of fascination, horror, and debate for centuries. Historians today must navigate a complex landscape of documented fact, legend, and sensationalized storytelling. While many accounts emphasize the grotesque details, his obesity, festering wounds, violent paranoia, and the explosive decomposition of his corpse, scholars also contextualize these within the broader political, social, and cultural dynamics of 16th-century England. The challenge lies in separating the man from the myth, while acknowledging that the myths themselves reveal important truths about the fears, obsessions, and moral perceptions of his contemporaries. Many of the most shocking stories, such as the exploding coffin or the stench that forced servants to flee, illustrate not only historical reality, but also the symbolic weight of Henry's reign. Chroniclers often amplified grotesque details to emphasize moral lessons, the dangers of excess, tyranny, and indulgence. Modern historians cross-reference medical records, court documents, and eyewitness accounts to reconstruct a more nuanced picture of the king's health, psychological state, and behavior. For instance, the suggestion that he suffered from Cushing's syndrome or complications from traumatic brain injury offers plausible explanations for his rapid weight gain, mood swings, and physical deterioration. The king's paranoia and obsessive control, too, are interpreted in the context of the political instability of the Tudor court. Threats of rebellion, plots, and foreign intrigue were real, and Henry's preoccupation with loyalty and betrayal, though extreme, was rooted in tangible risks. Yet the scale and intensity of his surveillance, legal manipulation, and violent punishment far exceeded what was necessary for survival, reflecting a personal psychological pathology intertwined with the exercise of absolute power. Henry's relationships, particularly with his wives, have also been re-examined. Beyond the popular narrative of executions and divorce, historians highlight the psychological trauma, coercion, and manipulation that defined these marriages. The detailed accounts of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and others illustrate not only the king's cruelty but the broader gender dynamics, legal structures, and societal pressures that shaped Tudor England. His personal obsessions, while extreme, were inseparable from the cultural and political frameworks of the time. The myths and legends surrounding Henry VIII, grotesque, terrifying, and sensational, serve as both historical records and cultural symbols. They reveal the extremes of human behavior under absolute power, offering insight into how fear, obsession, and spectacle can define not just a ruler, but an era. In understanding Henry VIII, historians balance the horrific realities with the symbolic narratives that have been passed down, illustrating a complex interplay of fact, interpretation, and legend. In the next part, we will examine how Henry VIII's reign influenced the subsequent monarchy and shaped the political, social, and cultural trajectory of England for generations. Henry VIII's reign left a profound and lasting imprint on the English monarchy. Beyond the shock, spectacle, and terror that defined his personal life, he fundamentally transformed the nature of kingship, governance, and authority in England. By asserting supremacy over the church, consolidating legal power, and reshaping the mechanisms of the court, Henry redefined what it meant to rule, both politically and psychologically. His successors inherited a monarchy shaped by fear, ceremony, and the dramatic assertion of authority. One of the most significant changes was the centralization of power. Henry's ruthless elimination of dissent, manipulation of laws, and control over religious institutions concentrated authority in the monarchy to an unprecedented degree. Future rulers from Elizabeth I to James I would navigate a court culture that Henry had molded, one in which loyalty was demanded, appearances were scrutinized, and the stakes of miscalculation were life-threatening. This culture of high tension and strategic maneuvering became a defining characteristic of the Tudor dynasty. The psychological legacy was equally potent. Henry's combination of spectacle, paranoia, and cruelty left a blueprint for exercising power through fear. The extreme displays of his wealth, the grotesque public visibility of his physical decline, and the terror he inflicted on courtiers and family members demonstrated that authority could be enforced as much through psychological domination as through military or legal means. English rulers, consciously or unconsciously, learned from his methods, adopting rituals, ceremonies, and symbols to reinforce their own control. Henry VIII also reshaped the social and cultural landscape. The dissolution of monasteries, redistribution of wealth, An imposition of new religious structures altered not only political power but social hierarchies. Communities, families, and individuals were forced to navigate the consequences of his policies, from economic disruption to shifts in moral and spiritual authority. These changes created a society attuned to obedience, ritual, and vigilance, mirroring the environment Henry had cultivated within his court. Even in popular memory, Henry VIII's influence endured. His reign became emblematic of both the dangers and allure of absolute power, a king whose charisma, ambition, and intelligence were inseparable from paranoia, cruelty, and grotesque obsession. He transformed the monarchy into an institution where personal will and spectacle could shape national destiny, leaving a model of rule that was as psychologically complex as it was politically potent. In the next and final part, we will reflect on Henry VIII as a historical figure, summarizing the intertwined legacies of his physical excess, paranoia, cruelty, and spectacle, and exploring why his story continues to captivate and horrify centuries later.